Greetings and welcome to the latest edition of Learning with Luke. It is our 2-year exploration of the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts. Today we are in the second half of chapter 14, which turns out to be a rather short chapter. Today's reading is only 12 verses long. Is it 12? It's 11 verses long. It is not very long. Now, just again, a reminder, I've said this before, is that the chapter numbers and the verse numbers are much later additions to the Bible. When Luke wrote it, he did not divide it into his own chapters, as often an author today would do when writing a novel or some sort of nonfiction book. These were ways for everyone to find the same place. And so sometimes the chapters get longer and sometimes they're shorter. Sometimes the divisions are rather arbitrary. Sometimes they make a lot of sense as Luke kind of works his way through his gospel story. But today's is short, starting in verse 25. Now large crowds were traveling with him, and he turned and said to them, "Whoever comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even life itself, cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not carry the cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. For which of you, intending to build a tower, does not first sit down and estimate the cost to see whether he has enough to complete it? Otherwise, when he has laid a foundation and is not able to finish, all who see it will begin to ridicule him, saying, 'This fellow began to build and was not able to finish.' Or what king, going out to wage war against another king, will not sit down first and consider whether he is able with 10,000 to oppose the one who comes against him with 20,000? If he cannot, then while the other is still far away, he sends a delegation and asks for the terms of peace. So therefore, none of you can become my disciple if you do not give up all of your possessions. Salt is good, but if salt has lost its taste, how can its saltiness be restored? It is useful neither for the soil nor for the manure pile. They throw it away. If you have ears to hear, then hear." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So the first part is about the cost of discipleship. And we sometimes talk about that. You know, we're in our stewardship campaign right now. And while we do not charge members to be members of the church, charge them financially, we generously and with full voice encourage all of our members to support the ministry, not only with time and talent, which is absolutely essential for the ministry, but also with your financial gifts, because it's expensive to run a church in the modern world. Our building alone costs us over $80,000 a year, almost $90,000. And staff and copying costs and website fees and all of those things add up. But Jesus is not here talking so much about financial costs. He's really talking about what it requires of us, what life change it requires. And he uses these really extreme examples. He says, "Whoever comes to me and does not hate father and mother," it's not even, value them less than me. It does not hate them. Our wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even life itself cannot be my disciple. So at first it sounds like, gosh, Jesus is really asking way too much of us. And then we start to see he is actually using hyperbole. He is using extreme language to get us to focus on what he's really talking about. And that's something we use all the time. It's exaggeration, or what in speech is called hyperbole, where you use grandiose and over-the-top speech and examples to get people to pay attention in the first place, to get them to consider what you're doing. Politicians will sometimes do that, either talking about a much greater tomorrow or how awful things are right now. Politicians always get far by reminding people how awful the crime rate is. Although right now the crime rate is as low as it's almost ever been. It's ticked up a little bit in the last couple of years, but murder rates and assault rates and all of these things are way, way down compared to the past. But Politicians will use hyperbole because it catches our attention, and then they can get us to vote for them or to support them. And so that's one of the things that Jesus is doing here. He is using extreme language to get us to think, so what do I have to give in order to be a disciple of Jesus Christ? And then Jesus switches to a more analytical kind of speech. He goes from, you must hate mother and father and wife and children and brothers and sisters, even life itself, if you will be my disciple. And then he talks about you have to actually analyze this. If you're going to build a tower, you don't want to get partway in. He uses the reason because people will ridicule you, and no one wants to be ridiculed. But it's just a waste. If you build a foundation for something you can't finish, why did you even start? And then he uses the example of a king who is going to war against another king. You sit down and think, okay, do I even have a chance against this guy? And if you don't, before the conflict begins, you sue for peace. You seek terms of peace because otherwise you'll be annihilated. That's just as common sense. And so we see this interesting kind of rhetorical or pedagogical, rhetorical meaning the kind of speech, pedagogical, the style of teaching that Jesus is using here. First, he uses extreme language to get our attention, to make us think, whoa, he is really serious. And then he moves into this analytical mode where you really want to explore what is it that the Lord requires of us. And if it's too much, then we won't start in the first place. And so Jesus is really talking about a seriousness of discipleship, not just the cost, but are we really serious about this? And when we think about, what does the Lord require of you? In the book of Micah, the answer is to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. Here Jesus is saying you have to hate even life itself. And he doesn't mean we hate our lives. What he means is we have to value him more than anything else. That's an extreme cost. And are we ready to do that? Are we ready to place Jesus, our discipleship, our willingness to follow him above everything else, even creature comforts, and at times it will be even life itself. There are the great Christian martyrs of history who loved the gospel more than their own lives, and while they did not seek an early death found them because they thought that their witness was more important than just continuing on. And that's what Jesus is asking us to confront. Are we willing to pay those kinds of costs? Because Jesus knows that there is both opposition in the world to the message that we have. I mean, Jesus was a teacher for 3 years, and then he was killed by both the religious authorities and the political authorities. Both of them found tremendous reason to oppose him and to get rid of him. Because for the religious establishment, if you don't need priests to have a relationship with God, if the point of our spiritual lives is to be in communion with God rather than just to be a part of a religious operation, those who benefit from that may become very frightened about it. And people will sometimes say to me even, aren't you afraid if you encourage people to pray for themselves or think for themselves, think theologically to do their own study, your work will be obsolete? Or sometimes when one of the youth preaches and does a particularly good job, people will come out and tell me, oh, you better watch out for your job. Now, I have two assurances in my work. One is while it is lovely to see people coming along who can do this work, there is always more need than there are workers. As Jesus said, the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. And so I always look forward to more laborers in the field. The other thing, too, though, is there is a part of me that would like to work myself out of a job, or at least out of this job, because Pastors and elders and deacons are always charged with too much work. And in fact, in Ephesians, we are told that the work of the pastor and evangelists and prophets and teachers and apostles is to equip the people for the work of ministry. We are not called to do the ministry for the church. Our job is to equip you, the disciples of Jesus, to be more faithful disciples of Jesus so the whole body comes together. And so in one sense, to work myself out of a job is the greatest, it's the highest goal that I could possibly attain. But in the meantime, there's lots of work and I stay busy. So Jesus is talking about the cost, and he starts with high rhetoric. He moves to this very analytical phase, and then to make sure that we don't miss it, he goes back to the high rhetoric. And after he says, the king will sue for peace if the odds are not with him, and then he says, so therefore, and you think he's going to say, so count the cost. He says, none of you can become my disciple if you do not give up all your possessions. Now we're back to hating mother and father, spouse and children, brothers and sisters, life itself. You have to give up all your possessions. And the question is, do we have to give up all of our possessions? I don't think any of us are in a position to really seriously consider that. And yet, at least as a experiment of thought, as a experiment of the Spirit, what would that be like if I gave up everything? Can I even imagine that? Can I imagine being so devoted to Jesus Christ that I would give up everything that gives my life security? And in my culture, often gives my life more meaning than I intended to give, but it does anyway. Everything from the labels on the clothes that I wear to the nameplate on the car that I drive to the neighborhood that I live in, all of those are signifiers of certain levels of achievement and of wanting to be accepted. And Jesus is asking, are you ready to give up all of that? That's what I'm asking. And then there's just this last little couple of verses that seemingly is totally different. It's about salt. Salt is good. In fact, both in Jesus' time and in our time, salt is necessary. Salt keeps us alive. But if salt loses its taste, how can its saltiness be restored? It's neither useful for the soil, that is, it's not fertilizer, nor for the manure pile. It will spoil the manure to become fertilizer. And so you just throw it away. And in one sense, he's linking this up to that last passage that he just said, that if you're not all in with me, are you really my disciple? And he's saying, if you lose your essence, and as followers of Jesus Christ, our essence is our devotion to him as it gets lived out, living out gospel values, which, as we go back to the early part of Luke, is preaching that the kingdom of God has come, which has that special emphasis on the poor and the dispossessed and the disinherited, and healing. And healing, again, is available to all people, but in Jesus' time and in our time. Health care and health needs are particularly and most keenly felt by those who are poor and live at the margins. And so Jesus is saying, if you lose your essence, what good are you? You're not worth keeping around. And so the question I want to leave us with, and I'll leave you with a little grace note at the end, is Jesus threatening to expel us? If you lose what you're all about, your saltiness, that gives food flavor, that can preserve food, that's a nutrient that we must have in our bodies in order to live. If we lose that, if we lose our love of Jesus, if we lose the love of following him, of doing his will, is Jesus just going to get rid of us? And he's suggesting that the answer is yes. That what Jesus is really looking for are disciples who are all in, who will not give up a moment to share the good news, to demonstrate his love, to heal those who need healing. And it's frightening, because if he is serious about that, and I've never known Jesus to be anything but serious, each of us is in trouble. But as we read the Gospels, we know that Jesus not only has a high cost to discipleship, but he is the Lord of grace. And we watch the disciples over and over again miss the point. They are thick-headed, they are stiff-necked, they are fearful, they are anxious. And Jesus never throws them away, but he reclaims them and restores their and our saltiness, so we can again give flavor to the world, preserve life, and be a necessary nutrient that everyone needs in order to have life, and life abundant, and life eternal. May God bless you in this challenging and yet hopeful passage. Amen.